everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today I wanted to do a video that I have never done before in the 5 years that Les and I have been running this booktube channel. I have never done a video about my favorite standalone books. I finished a particular book in March, which is my favorite book I've read so far this year, and it's a standalone book, and that made me start to think about all the awesome standalone books I have read, particularly since I started this channel. So I wanted to choose my top 10 and share them with you. The book that I'm referring to that I read in March is The Enchanted by Renee Denfeld. This is a fiction book that takes place in a prison, and it follows a few different characters whose lives all converge in this prison, and it's extremely atmospheric. It's written a little bit differently than a lot of other books that I've read, but it works so well, and it has a lot of gruesome things because it does take place in a prison, but it's written in such a calming way. I was reading this in busy airports while I was traveling, but this just totally sucked me out of that world and brought me into this one. And I know that a lot of people have read this and have probably read a lot of the other books I'm going to talk about, but this one was just so fantastic, and because I read it so recently, it's still pretty fresh in my mind, so I feel like I'm gushing a bit, but it is fantastic. My second book on the list is Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. Obviously, she's a very popular author now. Gone Girl sort of launched her career, I would say, but she did write 2 books before she wrote Gone Girl. This was her first book ever. It is in the same vein as Gone Girl. It is a thriller suspense novel, but it is much smaller, and I actually read this one first, so this was my first introduction to her. I read it in one sitting on a train, which I think did help with my reading experience of this, because it is one of those books that you don't want to put down. We have our character who goes back to her hometown because she has to do a story on some murdered preteen girls, but she has a lot of demons, a lot of negative feelings associated with growing up there, so she has to face those at the same time. And of course, it's Gillian Flynn, so there's a lot of like little dark twists and turns and uncomfortable moments, but it just worked so well. If you haven't read Sharp Objects, I really highly suggest that you do. Third on this list is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. This is a nonfiction, and it is about the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. If you have been following us on this channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me mention this book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. It pops up all the time in for different reasons. I read this in 2013. It's been 4 years now, and I still remember exactly where I was. I was on a train again, and just being completely sucked into the story. It was such a tense situation to read about this mountaineering disaster and all of these people that perished and all of the things that happened, and of course there's a lack of oxygen, so anything anybody's observing, you can't necessarily take it at face value because lack of oxygen changes how people perceive things. So there have been some people that say maybe this book isn't entirely accurate, and there have been other books written about the same disaster. So if you have heard about this disaster and maybe heard some of the controversy around the book, that's okay. Go into this book knowing that, but you will enjoy reading this book. It is an absolute page turner. The next book I want to mention is Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. I do not have a physical copy of this book. When I read it back in 2012, I actually borrowed it from the library, and it has stuck with me over these past 5 years. This is a young adult historical fiction book. It follows a 15-year-old girl who has to leave her home during World War II because the Soviets have come, and she gets shipped off to Siberia, and it was just such an emotional journey. It was so well written. It is young adult, but it's a very solid young adult book, and if you're somebody that doesn't read a ton of YA and is maybe looking for a suggestion, this is a book I would suggest. Next, I have Sarah's Key by Tatiana de Rosne. This was given to me by a friend, and it's one of the best books I've ever received. I had never heard of this book before, and then she gave it to me and I read it so quickly. It was so engrossing. The book follows Sarah, who is a young Jewish girl living in France, and the French police are rounding up Jews, and in order to protect her younger brother, she actually locks him in a closet, and then the rest of the family gets taken away. So that is one side of the story, and then we also follow a modern day woman who's doing some research on this time in French history and how those stories collide. It was gut-wrenching, but it was one of those books that really sucks you in as well. The next one is actually a middle grade book, and to have a middle grade book be on your top 10 standalones really means something. This one is Under the Egg. It's by Laura Marks Fitzgerald. It follows a young girl named Theo whose grandfather has just died, and she discovers this old painting hidden underneath another painting that he had, and she's a little bit worried because she's afraid that he might have stolen it, but she's also worried about the fact that she has to take care of her mom and take care of this old house that they're living in, and she doesn't know if maybe this painting might be able to help them in some way. I don't really go into middle grade books with a ton of high expectations, and so when I read this one, I had no idea how much I was actually gonna love it. So if you're somebody that's looking to pick up a fun, fast read and don't mind reading middle grade, I would definitely pick this one up. It's got great, well-written characters in it, and if I had a kid, I would definitely be encouraging my kid to read this book. This is one many of you will recognize. It's Room by Emma Donoghue. I have talked a couple times about how I kept putting this book off because it is written from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy, so it's written how a 5-year-old would talk, and that's not something I really like to read, but after putting it down for a while, I finally decided, no, I'm gonna do it, partially because the movie was coming out, and I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I pushed myself to read this because it was so good. It is a fiction book, but it has this element of thrill to it, kind of a thriller suspense, because Jack has spent his entire life living in this room with Ma, and he doesn't understand, but Ma was actually kidnapped when she was younger, and she's being held hostage in this room. She finally decides to tell him what's going on so they can hopefully make it out. The movie is brilliant as well, so if you've seen the movie and you're debating reading the book, definitely do it. If you've put this off because you're worried about reading the book from the voice of a 5-year-old, push yourself, just get over that hump, and then it gets easier once you get used to it, for sure. Another book that I want to mention that I don't actually own is Night Film by Marisha Pessl. This is another one that I borrowed from the library after it was making its rounds on BookTube and everybody was so pumped about it. I also thoroughly enjoyed my reading experience with this one because it really is an experience with this book. It is about a reclusive director and this reporter, and the reclusive director's daughter shows up dead, and this reporter who has looked into the director's history in the past thinks that, you know, there's a lot of funny stuff going on here, and last time he got so sucked into it that it kind of ruined his life, but he doesn't want to give up, so he wants to investigate again, and it just goes down this spiral hole. It's like a rabbit hole of all this creepy stuff, and it's a multimedia experience as well, so there's like pictures of different things and files in the book, and there's actually some things that you can listen to on your phone or on your computer that have to do with the book. I love books that do that. I live for them, and it's usually not something you see in an adult book, so having an adult fiction suspense thriller book that had those elements in it just really worked for me. I know that some people did not like their experience with the book, they just didn't like the story, so I'm not going to say it's for everyone, but it really worked for me. The second to last book I want to mention is Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan. This was in a previous year one of my favorite books I read. It is another nonfiction. The author is the person who experienced this, and she wrote this afterwards, so you know she makes it through. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this story is super scary. She basically comes down with something and nobody knows what it is. She isn't herself anymore, and eventually she wakes up so many days later in the hospital and she has no recollection of anything that's happened, and so in wanting to figure out what exactly happened, she sort of researches into herself. Watching yourself when you're going through something like that, I can only imagine how just unsettling it would be, but you do get an idea of how she felt because she's able to write about the experience afterwards and sort of realize how lucky she is that she was able to make it out of this. It's unsettling at times, but it is well worth the read. The last book I want to talk about is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. This one was another one that was hugely popular on BookTube a couple years ago, and of course I picked it up because I did like the sound of it, and I'm happy to say that it lived up to the hype for me. It's about a teenager named Wade who, like many other people at this time, basically live their lives in this virtual reality game called Oasis. It's a futuristic Earth and things are just going to shit basically, and everybody wants to live their lives in this game, but there's this contest that is announced, and so Wade, along with all these other people, are trying to find the clues to win the contest, and that is what you follow in this book. So if you missed the original hype train on this one and you've seen this around but you're not really sure, I would pick it up. And those are my 10 favorite standalone novels that I wanted to share with you guys. If you also loved any of these standalone novels, feel free to let me know down in the comments. And maybe if you want to share some of your favorite standalones, doesn't have to be your top 10, but if you want to share your top 5 or something, feel free to do that as well. As always, all of our links are in the doobly-doo. Check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you later.